Okay, well, good evening everyone, and welcome to this Centre for Public Policy seminar on the future of working conditions. Starting a little bit late, we will have some latecomers, so do be prepared for that. Hopefully it won't be too disruptive. There's plenty of room at the sides. My name's Helen Sullivan. I'm the Director of the Melbourne School of Government, and I'll be chairing this event this evening. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of this land, and pay my respect to the elders past and present of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to any other Indigenous Australians present. This is a first for us in a number of ways, and I want to talk about two of them. This is the first seminar that the Centre for Public Policy has held in its new home, which is the Melbourne School of Government. The Melbourne School of Government was launched a couple of weeks ago and is a new university initiative that brings together arts, law and business and economics in an effort to really focus our influence on public policy by developing our interdisciplinary research, by focusing our graduate teaching, and also by maintaining our commitment to engagement activities such as this. So from this point on, the Centre for Public Policy now becomes part of this broader school, and all of our future events will be held under the banner of the School of Government. It's also the first in a series of seminars that we are doing on the future of work. Researchers from all over the globe are now telling us that our lives as workers will be changing dramatically in ways that they and we don't understand. For some of us, that means a huge opportunity, the possibility to travel the globe, to experience multiple new exciting opportunities, and to have a satisfying and fulfilling career. For others of us, the prospects are slightly different. Change brings threat, it brings insecurity, and it brings challenge both to people's working lives and their practices, but also in some cases to their communities. Last year, Brian Howe, a distinguished fellow of the Centre for Public Policy, reported on the Commission of Inquiry that was commissioned by the Australian Council of Trade Unions. The report attracted a great deal of attention, focusing on insecure work, the implications of that for employers, for employees, and also for government policy. And we thought that this would be a really good opportunity to revisit some of those ideas and to have a broader conversation about what the future of work will look like, what it means for us, and importantly, what it means for policymakers. And so with the support of Brian Howe and Nick Rees, our Public Policy Fellow, we've put together a series of seminars that are going to be exploring some of the issues and challenges that arose during that Commission of Inquiry and some of the questions that maybe weren't asked but should have been asked. And we're starting that series this evening with a very distinguished group of extraordinary speakers who are experts in this field. Jed Carney, Edith Willocks and Bill Harley. Yes, well, if you didn't know I was going to say that, be prepared. No pressure. So we have all sides, I think, of the debate represented. We are hoping for, and I'm sure we will get, some lively contributions both from our contributors but also from you, the audience. We've asked each of our speakers to speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. That will give them plenty of time to disagree and argue amongst themselves, but it will also give you plenty of opportunity to ask questions and for us to have a thoughtful and informed conversation. The speeches will be filmed. You'll see that we have Matt at the back who's doing the filming. Our video casts are very well watched by people, and so we do make every effort we can to record the presentations. The Q&A, though, will not be filmed, so please don't have any concerns about saying what you would like to say. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Jed Carney, President of the ACTU. Jed was previously Federal Secretary of the Australian Nursing Federation, one of Australia's fastest growing unions, representing more than 200,000 nurses and midwives. She's been an elected official for 13 years, a registered nurse since 1985, working across the public and private acute sectors, including managing clinical nursing education at Austin Health. So please welcome Jed.
I'd like to thank Helen for acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and I too pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to thank the University of Melbourne School of Government for hosting tonight's seminar. It is a great pleasure to be here with my friend Ines Willocks from the Australian Industry Group and Bill Harley from the University's Faculty of Business and Economics. Ines and I find ourselves on these panels quite often, don't we, Ines? But it's good. It's good to have these debates. Well, we've heard quite a bit over the past week about the need to tackle challenges facing Australia by fostering a new period of collaboration between government, business and unions. And so I commend the University for bringing us together this evening. This might be it, the time. It is indeed a timely discussion for about exactly what that collaboration might look like, and I look forward to the discussion at the end particularly. And although our focus this evening is on the future of working conditions, I'd like to begin my remarks by placing today's workplace in some historical context. For the most part, the prevailing conditions enjoyed at work have developed incrementally, with a basic and enduring, if not sometimes fragile, consensus between capital and labour that has its roots in Australia's original federation settlement. The grand political compromise of the Australian settlement that developed in the first half of the 20th century comprised protection of industry, regulation of labour, and universal social security standards. The industrial relations plank of this consensus led to our conciliation and arbitration system, to the Harvester Judgment, and much later to the social wage. For most of the 20th century, this consensus endured, underpinned by a shared recognition amongst our decision makers and our economic actors of the importance of combining economic competitiveness with fairness. Changes to our industrial relations system, when they occurred, have generally taken place within this framework of consensus and collaboration. It's not to say that there weren't debates or points of contest, of course there were. But these debates were resolved with all parties at the table, and I believe the country is better for it. The shift in the late 1980s and the early 1990s away from centralised conciliation and arbitration towards our system based on enterprise bargaining, underpinned by an award safety net, is one of those changes that was agreed upon. The introduction of work choices by the former coalition government shook this long-standing consensus to its core. Through slashing the safety net upon which so many Australian workers rely, encouraging unfair individual contracts, undermining collective bargaining, and stopping workers from accessing union help, the legislation challenged a number of the very precepts upon which Australia's industrial relations system rested. Fortunately, work choices was short-lived. It was an aberration. The Australian people, in ousting the coalition government in 2007, firmly rejected the model as a way forward. Australians clearly voted against a system which pitted worker against worker and saw economic progress and fairness as mutually exclusive, and in favour of the enduring consensus upon which our industrial relations system stands and its values of fairness and a decent safety net. We now see the Fair Work Act as representing a continuation of the long-standard, albeit bruised, consensus in Australian industrial relations. The basic precepts of our conditions at work were provided for and restored: good faith bargaining, a central role for the independent umpire, a decent safety net in the form of modern awards, unfair dismissal rights, and an end to AWA-style individual contracts. Since the Fair Work Act was introduced, we've also seen other key improvements to working lives, including the introduction of a national paid parental leave scheme, stronger protections for workers when companies go under, pay equity for workers in the female-dominated social and community sector, and a much-needed increase in the superannuation guarantee. These developments have all had significant and positive impacts on the lives of working Australians. And despite claims to the contrary, the Fair Work Act has not had a negative effect on the Australian economy. Australia's fastest rate of productivity growth in decades was recorded in the mid-1990s and has been slowing ever since, including during the work choices period. In the mid-90s, labour productivity grew faster than average, and since then, the growth has been slower, but it has still been growing. It has not been going backwards. Ironically, a substantial part of the productivity slowdown has been due to the boom in mining that is frequently credited as our economic saviour. It is capital productivity, not labour productivity, that is the biggest drag on our growth. A big part of that is explained by large investments sunk in projects that are yet to deliver. Unions care about productivity growth. We want productivity growth because we know it is the only way to sustainably increase the national income. But it has to be a two-way discussion, with the benefits distributed equally. And we should take a broader view than the narrow focus on the cost of labour as an input to production, which the industrial relations debate far too often focuses on. Investing in energy efficiency, for example, reduces input costs while also providing a cost-effective way for addressing emissions and a transition to a low-carbon economy, hopefully a hallmark of future workplaces. In the 1990s, the gains were distributed fairly evenly between capital and labour. Total labour income in the economy grew at around the same pace as productivity. In the 2000s, real wages growth decoupled from productivity and has lagged behind ever since. In simple terms, labour's share of the national income has fallen, while returns to capital as a share of national income have risen. This is not just a concern from an equity perspective. It also has the potential to undermine further productivity growth, because productivity is more likely to increase when workers feel that they stand to gain a fair share of the dividends of that growth. And this is the fundamental choice Australia faces between the high road to economic prosperity, focused on improving wages and conditions by investing in skills and productivity and valuing our people, and the low road, where we simply prop up company profits by undercutting wages and conditions. So looking forward, I'd like to discuss some of the challenges that I believe Australia needs to tackle if we're to stay on the high road. It's no secret that the world has changed radically over the past 30 years. Among other things, globalisation, the transfer of manufacturing from North America and Europe to developing countries, and the internationalisation of banking and finance have reshaped national economies and shifted power away from nation states towards global corporations. The technological and communications revolutions have allowed international communication via the internet at speeds previously inconceivable, effectively shrinking the world we live and work in. The gender revolution, significant changes in living patterns, and the rapid ageing of populations in developed countries have reshaped our social structures. As a result, our relationship with work has changed, and the nature of the training and the skills challenge facing today's workforce is radically different. It has been said so often that it's almost a cliche, but there really is no such thing as a job for life. Rather than learning a single trade or a profession and then trading on those skills for a lifetime, today's worker is required to constantly update their skills. Technology has not just changed the nature of the work we do, but it has blurred the boundaries between our working and non-working lives. And we are far more likely to transition in and out of work and between family and caring responsibilities through different training and education requirements right throughout our working lives. These changes require new thinking about work, about the economy, and importantly, about the social compact between citizens, government, business, and workers. And there is no better example of the gaps in our current policies settlement than the growth of insecure work and the emergence of the core and periphery model of the labour market that proliferates today. Because today, more than ever, millions of Australians have little or no choice when and how they work, no economic security, and little control over their working lives. For too many people in this country, their jobs deliver unpredictable and fluctuating pay, inferior rights and entitlements, limited or no access to paid leave, a lack of certainty over job tenure, and a lack of any power or say at work. Whether they're employed in casual, fixed-term contract, or labour hire jobs, their working lives are defined by insecurity and a complete sense of powerlessness. Insecure work is not a new problem. In fact, it has been growing over the past 30 years. However, until recently, it has been something of a sleeper issue in Australia's public discussion. Casual employment has been transformed and entrenched in our economy as a tool to minimise costs rather than to deal with temporary or intermittent variation in the patterns of work. Over half of all casuals are permanent casuals who have been employed in their current job for over a year, and over 15% of casuals have been in their job for more than 5 years. Fixed-term employment is being used heavily by employers to avoid the costs associated with standard employment conditions like leave and the notice of termination, and particularly, surprisingly, in the public sector. You only need to think of the number of teachers employed today on rolling fixed-term contracts. The growth of the workforce management industry and the use of labour hire have created new avenues for cutting costs and transforming permanent jobs into casual positions. Independent contracting is being misused to mask employment relationships. ABS data suggests that around 40% of independent contractors have absolutely no authority over their own work. And sham contracting is far too common in many industries, such as construction. This highlights the point that the casual workforce is much broader than you think. As well as retail and call centres, hospitality and sales, people going through neighbourhoods, door knocking. It also includes teachers, academics, health professionals, admin workers, skilled workers in construction and resources. And this is not an exhaustive list. We've heard a lot about the virtues and benefits of the free market over the last 30 years, but it's not a free market when it's a choice between the employer's terms or being jobless. In truth, when it comes to trying to earn a steady wage, build a life or a career, millions of Australians actually live in fear. Not only can they not afford holidays and the handful of big purchases that are regarded by society as markers of personal progress, such as a decent car or a house, they can't afford to lose what employment they have. In the economic model that has developed in Australia since financial industrial practices were liberalised in the 80s, they are the Australians who have been pushed to the periphery of the workforce. And although they can least afford it, they are the ones who are being forced to take the risk when it comes to fluctuations in business conditions and the state of the economy. In many workplaces, it is no longer the managers and owners who bear the risk of a drop in sales and orders or a cash flow problem. It is the short-term employees and people who are hired as independent contractors or workers on fixed-term contracts. How has this happened? Most of us already understand the forces that made it possible. When the regulations and restrictions on industry pricing, banking, the currency and labour laws were loosened or wiped out even in the 80s and 90s, the economy internationalised. Technological developments in computerisation, communications and production processes pushed the pace of change. As I said earlier, insofar as these changes occurred as a result of government decisions, they occurred within a policy framework of consensus and collaboration. But that doesn't mean that all of the consequences could be forecast, or that there haven't been some unintended consequences of reform which have left many people behind. What we can see a generation on from when these changes really started to transform our country is that we were good at implementing the changes, but not so good at establishing equitable methods to deal with consequences. The drivers of insecure work are complex and there is no one single solution or remedy, but we believe a number of key reforms are needed to begin to address the issue. First, a basic protection against the growth in insecure jobs is ensuring that the non-standard forms of work, casual, fixed term, labour hire, contracting, etc., are only used for genuine and legitimate purposes. Measures must be in place to ensure these types of work cannot be abused by employers as a means of avoiding their responsibilities under our labour laws. This includes implementing stronger protections against sham contracting to ensure vulnerable workers are protected. A second area of reform is strengthening the right to request flexible work arrangements in the Fair Work Act. Earlier I mentioned improvements the government is making to this right now. We know that without real choices to accommodate their responsibilities, many carers today, mostly women, are forced out of decent jobs into low-paid, low-skilled, insecure, casual work. In this context, the government's recent amendments to the right to request flexible work arrangements are very welcome, but we think they don't go far enough. The current right to request working arrangements that meet caring responsibilities is still not enforceable. What is a right without enforceability? Employers can simply refuse on reasonable business grounds, and employees have no right of appeal. The right to request alternative work arrangements and the right to request an extension of unpaid parental leave are the only two rights in the Fair Work Act that specifically deny employees access to dispute resolution. Both impact predominantly women. The ACTU has consistently argued that the right to request needs to be underscored by an effective right of review. Employees must have the right to appeal employers' unreasonable refusal of their request, including access to arbitration if necessary. Third, the dramatic shifts we've witnessed in how we work in the structure of our labour market also raises questions over the effectiveness of our traditional accrual models of leave entitlements. Paid leave entitlements are fundamental to the financial and social security of workers, yet we continue to have a system of contingent entitlement to forms of leave, whether it's long service leave, annual leave, or sick leave, or carers leave, that tends to presuppose permanent ongoing employment and so excludes a huge proportion of our workforce. The ACTU is currently investigating models for a nationwide, national, portable leave scheme so as to ensure that all workers can access basic leave entitlements. Unfortunately for those who find themselves in the development of the core and the periphery workforce has attracted little scrutiny. And despite growing interest and research by academics, it has slipped under the radar of our political class. Increasing polarisation in the workforce follows from and reinforces a narrow definition of the desired skills that make workers attractive to employers, as opposed to broader upskilling strategies that strengthen workforce capability, addresses the polarisation and meets industry needs in a changing and demanding business environment. The issue is less about having an adequate safety net and more about employers having a narrow view of our workforce potential, leading in an unwillingness to invest in people and their skills. The recent debate, as unpleasant as it has become at times over the misuse of 457 visas by some employers, reinforces this point, I think. It's obvious that Australia needs new and less hierarchical forms of work organisation if we are to get the most from our workforce. This will also require more inclusive strategies designed to increase workforce potential, such as new and innovative ways to skill and allow people to access new skills. The alternative is a more of the same, a disposable worker syndrome even, that undervalues the potential of our greatest asset, which is our people. Taken together, what is ultimately needed is a new social compact or settlement that accounts for the changes in our economy and the nature of work, and provides the right balance of economic competitiveness and fairness to take us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jed. We're going to have a bit of a hiatus now while Matt fixes up the microphone, but that will give me ample opportunity to introduce Innes Willocks, who's the CEO of the Australian Industry Group. And in a way, I was reading the CV for Innes, and it's interesting because you could see his career in a way as representative of some of the flexibility that it's been suggested the new world of work offers us. So the AI Group represents diverse business sectors, including manufacturing, defence, ICT and labour hire. And collectively, these employers employ more than 1 million people. And Innes works closely with federal and state governments on trade, defence, climate, industrial relations and communications policy. But this is the really interesting bit. Prior to this, Innes was Australian Consul General to Los Angeles, Chief of Staff to the Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs in Singapore, Singapore Airlines Manager of Global Public Affairs, and Chief Political Correspondent, then Chief of Staff at The Age. So I'll be very interested to hear how Innes approaches this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to you and to Nick for putting together tonight's event. And also I'd like to acknowledge the presence of former Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, who's with us here tonight as well. So thank you all for being here. I thought when Jed said this could be the last time, she was about to run off for pre-selection for Layla or somewhere like that. And she'd do that really well too, may I say, if that were to happen. So go for it, Jed, that's all I'll say. We do live in the era of 24/7 workplaces. I'm actually on holiday at the moment and here I am. So I feel your pain. Look, what I wanted to talk about today was something a little bit different, and I'm very happy to talk about the industrial relations landscape in the Q&A part of our discussion. And I'll touch on it very lightly, but I don't want to make that the front and centre of what I want to talk about tonight. Rather, I'd want to talk about the way that we do work and how that then impacts on our working conditions more generally, and the challenges we face more at a macro level on how we work and how it contributes to our national productivity. But I won't ignore industrial relations, and I'm very happy to come back to it later. My central message today is that we can continue to transform the way we work to ensure that we, and more to the point, following generations, can make the most of the very considerable opportunities that lie before us in Australia. We're optimists, we're not pessimists about our future, although we must say that we do face considerable challenges in the short period ahead. It's anything but a lay-down misere that we will take advantage over the longer term of our opportunities that are before us, and to do so will require hard work in the national sense, a willingness to take risks, and to question and renew our habits, our institutions, and indeed our mindsets. In a year in which we have back-to-back Ashes tests, which I fear will lose 10-0, you might excuse a cricket analogy, and that is that this is not a game that we'll win by guarding our stumps and playing backward defensive shots. We need to take bold strokes and some judicious excursions outside the off stump beyond the comfort of our crease if we're to take advantage of these opportunities that are before us. My contention is this: that we can become more productive as a nation, that we can become more thoroughly integrated into the global economy and particularly into the region to our north and northwest, that we can build on the inroads that many Australian businesses and individuals have already made and are continuing to make as providers of high-value goods and services that will surge undoubtedly in demand as the Asian century unfolds and as the size of the Asian middle class balloons. We can continue to build on our traditional sources of strength. We are a relatively well-educated and pragmatic people. We are rich in mineral and energy resources. We are a high-yield producer across an array of rural goods, particularly food. We are a competitive and innovative supplier of a range of excellent and high-quality manufactured goods. We have a strong construction and logistics sector. And we are an attractive destination for tourists, skilled workers from around the globe, as well as, of course, students from around the globe. And the tyranny of distance is being overthrown right before our eyes, even tonight, as technology shrinks the world and as the economic centre of gravity moves from north to south and from west to east. Even with all this going on, the reality is we could still blow it. We could leave our national infrastructure in its current inadequate state, or even worse, let it deteriorate further. We could continue to see layers of our federation work in uncoordinated, duplicative and unproductive ways. We could miss the importance of developing cultures of innovation, not only among our business owners and among our managers, but also amongst our public sector managers and indeed right across the broader workforce. We could tie ourselves up in costly and debilitating red tape and green tape by missing the opportunities to be smart about achieving our regulatory objectives. We could leave our, quite simply, irrational tax system unreformed. And we could continue to adopt an excessively defensive approach about our workplace relations, work practices and workplace cultures by focusing too heavily on security rather than on opportunity. So, as I said, you'll be pleased to hear that I'm not going to dominate my remarks by delving into the detail and the range of these issues, but I just wanted to lay those out to you to give some broader context for my contribution on the future of work and workplace conditions, and I think the two are interrelated. Work and workplaces do not exist in a vacuum. Rather, they are closely connected to the broader economy and the broader economy into which they are embedded. And I think it's useful to frame the discussion about work and workplace conditions by being aware that Australia is at something of a crossroads. While we enjoy comparatively high standards of living compared to many others close by us, and while, particularly in the past 2 decades of the last century, we showed a tremendous ability through governments of both colours to modernise, to transform our institutions and to spread the benefits across the community more broadly. More recently, it's fair to say that our successes have rested more on good luck than on good management. The strong lift in commodity prices from the early 2000s boosted real income growth well in excess of the increase in our productive capacity. Indeed, our productivity growth, particularly when measured in terms of multi-factor productivity growth, stagnated over the past decade. It's true that in recent times our labour productivity growth, that is defined as output per hour worked, has lifted. But this has occurred after a period of phenomenal investment, absolutely unprecedented investment in new capital, particularly in the resources sector. When the larger capital stock is taken into account, our productivity record continues to lag. Commodity prices are now on their way back to earth. We can see that every day. The other day, the Reserve Bank released its commodity price index that showed a fall in commodity prices by 10.5% over the past year. In June alone, the index fell by 4%. With changes in commodity prices subtracting from national income rather than adding to it, we need now to unearth alternative sources of growth. Sure, higher volumes of mining output will help, but on their own, they won't do the trick. We need to lift productivity broadly across the economy to ensure that we have a new phase of growth ahead of us and that it will contribute to a diversified and a resilient national economy. Workplace conditions and changing patterns of work are central to this broader agenda. In what follows, I'd like to comment briefly on some of the main influences that demography, globalisation and technology are having and are set to have on the work that we all do, and then give you a flavour of the directions that Australian Industry Group would like to see workplaces travel in the more broader sense, including workplace relations. And then I'll close by listing a few areas for government action and consideration. Let's look at our workforce. Let's look at the demography. The combination of the fall in the birth rate from a couple of generations ago and ever-lengthening life expectancies guarantees that the ageing of the Australian population will be a central feature of this century. We can ameliorate the trend somewhat by maintaining a strong immigration policy and doing what is possible to make it easier for people to have kids. But that amelioration is the best that we can expect. There are a few important factors that flow out of this demographic destiny that Australia has. First, people will want to work well past what we used to think of as their retirement age. We've already seen this with large increases in participation rates among older people, and most do not seem to want full-time employment but want to work on a part-time or on a casual basis. Second, and more fundamentally, the workforce will shrink as a share of the total population. There will be proportionately less producers and more consumers. As the demographic pattern matures, increasingly labour will become more scarce. If we look at this in a bargaining power framework, we will be likely to see decreases in hours worked and more pressure on employers to lift wages and have more favourable working conditions. We've had more than a hint of this in the period before the global financial crisis, when the unemployment rate reached around 4%, which is about full employment in anyone's book. We also saw average hours worked fall, moving against a trend towards longer hours that had been evident when unemployment was higher and bargaining power correspondingly lower. Increasingly in this regard, it's worth recalling the recent, that is in April, Productivity Commission staff working paper on different forms of work in Australia, and that pointed out that in the decade to 2011, that the only form of work that increased was the permanent employment, with neither casual nor fixed-term employees any more prevalent than 10 years earlier. As part of these developments, it's also likely that people will be more on the move, and this might involve changing jobs more frequently, taking more breaks from work for life reasons, study reasons, family reasons, putting together portfolios of work with more than one employer, and returning to an organisation to work for a second or a third stint. Another impact on work of the ageing of the population will be the increase in the relative importance of a range of health and ageing services and a greater gearing of services across the economy to better service and accommodate an older population. Let me just turn to globalisation and the impact that will have on workplace conditions. It will undoubtedly exert major impacts on work in Australia. We can expect further global competition. Over the past 10 or 15 years or so, we've seen the impacts of the integration of an industrialising China into the global economy. Over the decades ahead, we believe we can expect this to continue, and for two very other populous nations, India and Indonesia, to travel down this route along with a number of smaller countries. We can also expect that as these countries step up the income ladder, as their levels of education attainment lift, and as they move into the supply of more sophisticated goods and services, that this competition will be felt even more broadly across economies like Australia. At the same time, we can expect their wages to rise at much faster rates than in developed economies, and for cost differences to narrow. Indeed, this is very apparent in China right at the moment, where employers are noticing a trend of increasingly high wages in China, which is impacting on investment in that country. And this trend will only become more apparent as their labour force stops growing in China, something that's expected in the next few years. So we would expect greater competition, but over time, not merely on the basis of cost. The other side of these developments is that incomes and consumer demand can be expected to rise, creating terrific opportunities for Australian producers of goods and services. You've got to remember, though, that these opportunities aren't just our domain. They're not reserved exclusively for us in Australia, and the rest of the world is also eyeing them with more than a little interest. While we certainly look forward to continued mineral and energy exports, but this will mean that we certainly look forward to continued mineral and energy exports, but with negligible impacts on domestic employment levels. There are also considerable opportunities for Australia as a supplier of food or of tourism, of health and education services, and a range of sophisticated, high value-added manufactured goods and businesses and consumer services. So we have enormous opportunities. On its own, global competition will temper the degree to which domestic demographic forces create a scarcity of labour. We could simply import more of the goods and services to meet our consumption needs. At the same time, to the extent that Australia can grab slices of growing global markets, we would be matching, and ideally more than matching, our greater reliance on imports with greater exports of goods and services. If we can be successful in this, we would also be reinforcing the scarcity of labour in the domestic market. In a way, it's the same old story. The more we can lift our productivity and compete globally, the more our wages and working conditions will improve. Technology has also changed the nature of work and workplace conditions and will continue to change it. Jobs will become obsolete, but new jobs will be created. Somehow, predictions to the effect that this or that new technology will wipe out jobs never seem to come true, at least in net terms. The number in employment in Australia keeps growing. Sure, there is often considerable adjustment, and for some people there is unfortunately no next job. There is no sign though that the pace of introduction of new technology is slowing, and successfully transitioning people into new jobs is an area that we can and should manage as a country much better. It goes to the heart of our skills training and education base. Similarly, we can improve the ways we introduce new technologies and more generally, how we introduce innovations into our workplaces. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Before doing that, I'd like to quickly mention one interesting way that technology is changing work and is expected to change it further, namely through teleworking. Last year, we jointly convened the National Telework Forum as part of Teleweek 2012, and we also published case studies of successful teleworking arrangements at several businesses. And telework offers important benefits for employers in terms of cost reduction, productivity improvement, and access to a wider pool of potential workers. It also offers benefits to employees and contractors who can also achieve greater flexibility and quality of life, and who are less constrained by geography in looking for work opportunities. There's also a range of wider public benefits, for instance in the form of the reduction in congestion on our roads and our railways and our trams, to the extent that commuters telework instead. Of course, there are risks to be managed, especially management worries about employee productivity and employee worries about inclusion and advancement prospects. Teleworking is not as widespread in Australia as it is, for instance, in the United States, but there are strong signs that it is growing here in Australia, and the Commonwealth has a target of that 12% of the workforce will be teleworking to some extent by 2020. Just want to talk briefly about what is called, or what we know as, high-performing workplaces. To do that, I'd like to refer to some of the work that the Australian Industry Group released last year from our High Performance Workplaces research project conducted with the Department of Employment, Education, Employment and Workplace Relations. These publications are available on our website, but they included a formal research report, a number of case studies, and what we called a workplace productivity tool for businesses to use as a way of assessing and improving their own business practices. To give you a high-level flavour of it, we found that, quote, high-performance workplaces are focused on maximising the potential of their workforce and utilising this potential for mutual benefit and comparative advantage. They do this by recruiting competent workers, involving them in extensive training, and creating or redesigning jobs which will provide them with challenge, responsibility and control. In doing so, they enable the effective utilisation of skills and reduce the occurrence of skills mismatch. That is, that where workers do not have the skills for the jobs they are doing, they are overskilled for their jobs. High-performance organisations have flatter management structures, promote participatory decision-making and share business information with employees. They apply performance-related reward and recognition systems. Work is organised around the principles of teamwork, lean production and quality management, and processes are supported by current and relevant technologies. It's fair to say that many Australian workplaces are a long way short of being high-performance workplaces in this sense. But these are the directions in which workplaces and their employees need to be led if we are to be as innovative as we need to be, and if we are to lift our productivity performance. What is needed both in the short term as we look for alternative sources of growth, following the mining boom, which seems to be coming to an end quite rapidly, and over the coming decades as we strive to take advantage of the rapidly growing opportunities in the Asian region. So we're asked to offer our thoughts on what governments need to do in the face of the transformation of work and the conditions that surround it. From my perspective is, what can governments do to facilitate and encourage the transformation of work that will help us to build productivity and competitiveness? If we can do this, we'll not only secure our economic good fortune at a national level, but more importantly, we'll also lift wages and improve working conditions. So, here's a quick list. Governments can support research into and dissemination of information about best management practices. They can lead by adopting innovative practices and building innovative cultures in their own workplaces. They can sort out better ways to ensure that we have the right infrastructure, particularly broadband infrastructure, needed to boost domestic productivity. Governments can act by actively reducing regulatory burdens. They can free the time of owners and managers, particularly of small and medium-sized businesses, to focus on improving their workplaces. They can help businesses and employees lift workforce skill levels. They can support business-led innovation and support greater collaboration between businesses, universities like this one, and other research institutions. And of course, I can't end before mentioning the important area of workplace relations reform. I'm happy to go into it in questions, but we, and I mean Australia, needs flexible and adaptive workplaces and workplace conditions to allow us to take advantage of these opportunities, but with the appropriate safeguards and checks and balances in place. Right at the moment, though, we have become too bogged down in Australia in obsessions around security of work, the rights of unions in workplaces, and in ever-increasing reporting requirements of workplaces to government. In the end, some of this might help unions, but it doesn't help employees, doesn't help employers, and it doesn't help lift national efforts to boost productivity, which is so important to our future. So I'm happy to go into the nitty-gritty of workplace relations a little bit later, but there is some of the macro level picture that we believe we see our country moving in, where some of the challenges of workplaces and the conditions within those workplaces will be essential to our economic vitality and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ines. We already have a lot to talk about, I think. Our final speaker, who we've asked to both make his own contribution, but to also draw some threads together, maybe highlight some key issues, take the conversation in a particular direction, is Professor Bill Harley, who is Professor at the School of Marketing and Management and also Associate Dean at the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. As Professor of Human Resources Management, Bill's research focuses on new forms of labour management and their implications for employees and for organisations. He's published in many prestigious journals, as you would expect. He's also the general editor of the Journal of Management Studies, and he consults widely with local and international organisations, including the ILO and the OECD. Bill, welcome.
Well, let me start by thanking Helen and Nick for inviting me here. It's a treat for me to get out of the office and interact with Capital and Labor, sandwiched between them. And thanks very much for coming. I will make some comments that relate to some of the things that both Jed and Innes have said. We didn't compare notes, but I think there are a few common threads. I won't be trying too hard to bring them together or find common ground or anything like that. I'll more be focusing on talking about some things that I think are important. I mean, the central sort of theme in this seminar was change. And I'm always struck by the fact that we're constantly being told that everything's changed in the world of work. This is something that business consultants, journalists, commentators of various kinds, and also academics tell us all the time. Everything's changed in the world of work. It's all different. It's all new. We've got to change completely. This is not new. One thing that doesn't change is that people keep telling us this. You can find this at least for the last 50 years or so, and probably longer. And I don't think that's terribly surprising. There's a pretty good reason for that, and that is that if you want to be a famous guru, professor, consultant or whatever, what you shouldn't say is nothing much has changed. We all have products to sell, right? By far the most common claim which occupies me in my research and teaching is this claim there's been some sort of fundamental change in the trajectory of capitalism. And that because of the growth of information technology, globalisation, demographic change and so on, we're seeing some sort of fundamental shift. And it's a shift towards things like knowledge work and post-bureaucratic organisations and everybody doing creative, highly skilled, rewarding work in good working conditions. We're commonly also told that management practices are changing alongside this, that we're seeing a shift away from traditional sort of approaches that focus on controlling employees to approaches which are based on building trust and commitment, on transforming the employment relationship. So we see a reduction in conflict and more cooperation. With this goes this sort of claim that in the world of work everybody's a winner now because of these changes. Everybody benefits. And I want to talk a little bit later about some of the potential for everybody to win up to a point, but I also want to make the point tonight that this is a fantasy. But I think one of the reasons these sorts of claims keep getting trotted out is not just that people like me have a product to sell, but it's also that there are grains of truth in these claims about change. So what I want to do tonight is start by talking about some of the things that have changed in the world of work and that I think are important. Then I want to talk about some of the things that haven't changed. And I'll finish the haven't changed bit by talking about some of these issues around labour management practices and the kinds of issues that Innes talked about with high-performance workplaces or high-performance work systems, and reflect on some of the things which government might do to encourage those sorts of practices. Some of what I say about that will probably be consistent with Innes's views, and some will probably be quite different and may give solace to Jed. Okay, so what are some of the things that have changed out there? Clearly occupational structures have changed. There's absolutely no doubt about that in Australia we've seen a really significant shift in the kinds of jobs that people are doing. Okay, I probably don't need to provide you with ABS stats to convince you that service sector jobs are growing at the expense of other sorts of jobs. To use a crude sort of distinction, white-collar jobs are replacing blue-collar jobs. I don't think that's terribly surprising. And a lot of people want to argue that this is the growth of knowledge work. This is the growth of the creative class. People who are working with data and symbols in a creative way and having a terrific time. Is this what's happening? To some extent, it might be. This is what I say about there being a grain of truth in some of these claims. Certainly, professional employment has grown massively in Australia. If you look at the period between the 1980s and the first decade of this century, the number of professional employees in Australia, so this is our highly skilled professionals at the top of the occupational hierarchy, we've seen a doubling of absolute numbers and an increase from about 15% of employees to about 20% of employees. Clearly, professional work accounts for most of the jobs growth in Australia during that period. But I think we need to temper that by thinking about what sort of professional jobs have grown during that period, because it's highly questionable that this represents the growth of knowledge work. A lot of these jobs have been more routine kind of professional jobs, like technical salespeople and accountants. I mean, I know some accountants are highly creative, but generally this is a fairly routine sort of work. But the other thing that's happening at the same time is there's growth at the bottom of the occupational hierarchy. In terms of jobs growth during that period, the next most important group to look at is at the very bottom of the occupational hierarchy. So routine clerical, sales and service workers. So these are our security guards and our call centre operators and our aged care assistants and people like this. These occupations haven't grown at the same rate as professional employment, but they do now account for around 10% of jobs. So what I would see there is not some sort of single trajectory, but actually a bifurcation of the labour market. So this sort of echoes the point that Jed was making about the growth of core and periphery arrangements. I think the second thing that's changed really significantly in recent years is working hours. Okay, if we look at average hours worked in Australia, they kind of went up. They flattened off a bit and even I think slightly decreased in about the last decade. But the problem with averages, of course, is that they mask difference. And if we look at working hours, again, we see something of a bifurcation. So we have, I think, about 1 in 6 people in Australia now reporting that they work more than 49 hours a week. And where we've seen the increases have been in very long hours and very short hours. So the average figure is masking the fact that we've got mostly more highly skilled professionals working long hours, and then we've got people at the bottom of the occupational hierarchies who are tending to work relatively short hours, and often actually, in spite of some of what we hear about this, would like to work longer hours. And the final thing I'd want to comment on very briefly, because this has already been covered in previous comments by my fellow panellists, is the growth of insecure work. And I think there are a couple of things happening there. One thing we need to remember is that the growth of casual work is not a recent phenomenon. Really, we can see these forms of employment growing from at least the 1960s onwards. This is a really long-run structural shift in the Australian labour market. It's not something that's just happened overnight as a result of changes in regulation. We are also, as Ines alluded to, seeing more mobility in jobs, but I think that the nature of that mobility again varies between different sorts of occupations. My impression, this is based not on rigorous survey research, but talking to people in the course of my work, is that, as you might expect, highly skilled professionals have a lot more control about the way they move between jobs than our low skilled workers who are moving between jobs involuntarily. Okay, so what this tells me is we're not seeing a single trajectory of change in Australia towards better conditions for all. We're seeing something more complicated. And what I've tried to highlight, I guess, is the major differences in the change, that we're seeing winners and losers, as we always do in any kind of period of structural change. We're seeing good jobs and bad jobs. We're seeing, to some extent, a core and a periphery in the labour market. So what hasn't changed in the world of work? There are a bunch of things that haven't changed, which may seem quite obvious to you, but bear with me. There is a point to this in terms of what I'm going to say subsequently. I mean, I think the first thing that hasn't changed, contrary to what a lot of business gurus, journalists and other commentators tell us, is the nature of the employment relationship. Most people in Australia still have to sell their labour to live. Okay, sure, there's a social security system, but it's a pretty limited one, and the most likely outcome of not being in paid work is poverty. And of course, employers still need workers. I mean, this is something that hasn't changed for an awfully long time. And of course, the employment relationship is exactly the same as it's ever been. It's a mixture of conflict and cooperation, and you can't ever take the conflict out. Doesn't matter how well people are managed. The conflict doesn't disappear, but nor does the need for cooperation. There's always some degree of shared interest between capital and labour. The second thing that doesn't change is the thing that I've alluded to in terms of bifurcation in occupational structures, and that is we will always have weak groups and strong groups. We'll always have winners and losers. And in a general sense, employers tend to have the upper hand. Okay? Even if there are labour shortages in particular areas, generally we see employers having the upper hand, particularly large employers. And among employees, we see the strong and the weak, okay? And as circumstances change, some come out better than others. There's also, as ever, a huge amount of pressure on industry for productivity gains, something that Innes alluded to. There are a variety of stakeholders who put pressure on employers, and undoubtedly some of the changes in the world economy have led to greater competition for Australian organisations. That's undoubtedly true. I think the other thing that hasn't changed, and this is where I'm going to talk about some of the issues that Innes spoke about towards the end of his presentation, is what hasn't materialised is this widespread shift in the management of labour. We haven't seen this widespread shift to high-performance workplaces. For the most part, okay, with some very notable exceptions, for the most part, labour is managed in rather similar ways to how it always has been. Some employers are fantastic, some are average. Many manage their staff as if they were disposable resources and an expense. And I think that's a shame. I mean, I'm very much in agreement with Innes's view that particular approaches to work organisation and so on do have the potential to boost productivity at the same time as they improve the working conditions of the people employed in the organisations. And this is an area that I've spent most of my academic career working on, this area of so-called high-performance work systems or high-performance work practices. The idea that organisations which have good jobs, so team-based work, high-skill, high-autonomy work, which have systems which individually or collectively link pay to performance and which invest in training, perform better than other organisations. I don't think these ideas are new. What's new is the amount of really strong evidence that these practices work, that organisations which use these things systematically as packages, so work organisation, training and performance management and pay systems, do perform better than organisations which don't. And this is borne out in very large studies at the national level in Australia and elsewhere, at the industry level, across a whole lot of different occupational groups. Okay? These things work. And at the same time as they work in terms of improving labour productivity, reducing turnover, improving product and service quality, they also deliver better outcomes for employees on average. Okay? If you survey employees who work in organisations with these practices, they report higher satisfaction, higher commitment, less intention to leave the workplace. In studies, at least that I've been involved in, lower levels of stress and burnout. So what that tells me is that these sorts of management practices do have some potential to deliver what we might regard as better jobs. And, sorry? Okay, I'll be really quick, Helen. My watch tells me I've still got 5. It's a pretty accurate watch, but I'll try and be really quick, yeah, sorry. Okay, so my question is, okay, if these things work, what should government do about them? And Innes has said a few things about that. I want to say a few things more. I mean, I think there are some pretty good reasons that these things aren't widespread, okay? They cost money to implement. There's no doubt about that. They're an investment. I think historically, managers in Australia have adopted quite a different kind of managerial strategy to employers in some other countries, notably in continental Europe. Obviously, government can't regulate for innovative labour management practices in the way that they might be able to regulate things like compliance with awards or agreements. And I don't have a simple answer to what governments might do, but there are a couple of things that flow from the evidence that we have. Okay, one of these is that if we look cross-nationally, countries that have well-developed institutional systems for regulating industrial relations are much more, these practices are much more prevalent in those sorts of systems. Why? Because those sorts of systems manage disputes and encourage some degree of collaboration, cooperation between unions and employees and management. And there's certainly very, very good evidence that these sorts of good management practices are actually more prevalent in unionised workplaces than non-unionised workplaces. So to the extent that governments enact legislation which encourages orderly industrial relations and cooperation, these practices are more likely. I think the other thing which there's some evidence about is what's often called light touch regulation. So this is the kind of thing that Innes talked about. So funding projects, publicising success stories and so on. Now Australia's got a fairly patchy history in that respect. There were certainly some initiatives in the early 1990s, the best practice program. Not much of that stuck, but some of it did. But I think really some sort of light touch regulatory approach in the context of a good system of institutionally regulated industrial relations is the sort of configuration that's most likely to lead to these sort of good management practices. And on that last point, I would like to draw your attention to the recently announced Centre for Workplace Leadership, which will be hosted by the University of Melbourne, funded by the federal government, with cooperation from a number of peak bodies, including the ACTU, and we hope that very soon the Australian Industry Group. This is an example of light touch regulation which attempts to bring together employers, the union movement, government and academia to work together on workplace innovation. And I'm so frightened of Helen, I'm going to finish now.